Chapter 25, Section 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. Recording by Linny. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 25, Literature from the Death of Tiberius to Trajan, 37 to 117 A.D. Section 1. Literature under Claudius and Nero. After the lull during the reign of Tiberius, literary activity was awakened again under his successors. But it has no longer the freshness of inspiration which characterized the epoch of Augustus. The golden age has passed, the silver age has begun. There is no doubt that the political events at Rome exercised an unfavorable influence on literature. The despotism of Tiberius in his later years, the wild career of Caligula, the vicissitudes under the rule of the wives and freedmen of Claudius, the follies of Nero, did not constitute a genial atmosphere for the development of successors to Virgil, Horace, and Livy. The contemporaries of Augustus had witnessed order arisen out of disorder, and the world set to rights. But to Romans under Claudius and Nero, the world seemed to have gone mad. The men who write are no longer proud of their age or confident of the future. They regard the government with distrust, knowing not what a day may bring forth. They look upon the Caesar's palace as a scene of intrigues, guile, and violence. There is nothing in public life to inspire them. Literature retreats into itself. Most of the works produced during this period are either of a reflective character or concerned with scientific subjects, or mere imitations of older literature. In both poetry and history, the great Augustan writers are regarded as the models to be followed, and earlier authors are looked down upon as vastly inferior. All kinds of composition are marked by rhetoric, the result being that the prose is poetical and the poetry prosaic. It has been already mentioned that Claudius and Nero were themselves authors, Claudius an historian, Nero a poet. Claudius was incited in his youth to historical studies by Livy himself. None of his compositions remain, with the exception of part of the speech which he delivered in the Senate in 48 A.D. for the admission of the Gallic nobility to the Roman magistracies. The memoirs of the Empress Agrippina were an important source for the secret history of the court of Claudius, but they have also been lost, as well as other contemporary records of their own experiences by prominent men of the day. Thus Domitius Corbulo wrote an account of his exploits in the Armenian wars. Suetonius Paulinus, whose name we chiefly associate with Britain, described his deeds in Mauritania, and Lucius Antistius Vetus wrote a work on his experiences as commander in Germany in 58 A.D. All these works, whatever their literary value, would have had great historical interest if they had been preserved. The only historian of this age whose work has reached us is Quintus Curtius Rufus, of whose life we know nothing. He wrote a history of Alexander the Great in 10 books, of which the 2 first are lost. He derived his information from Greek writers, but displayed no critical faculty in using his sources. His style is modeled on that of Livy, but is unconsciously influenced by the mannerisms of his own age. He strives ever antithetic sentences and poetical expressions. He hardly appreciates the political greatness of Alexander, but regards his eastern expedition as a brilliant adventure. He has an eye for the more telling episodes, and hurries rapidly over all that is less striking, though perhaps more important. Seneca is the most characteristic and interesting literary figure of this age. All the great Augustan writers were Roman or Italian, but Seneca was a Spaniard of Cordoba. We have already met his father, the rhetorician, a man of some literary note. The provinces are now beginning to play a prominent part in Roman literature, or rather Spain is setting the example to the other subject lands. 2 other conspicuous authors at this time were of Spanish origin, Seneca's nephew, Lucan, and Columella of Gades. The writings of Seneca reflect in many ways the spirit of the age. He wrote on a variety of subjects, but his most important works are philosophical and contemplative. His philosophy was popular in style as well as in matter. He desired the applause of his contemporaries. Literary vanity was a feature of the time, and did not write with a view to the judgment of posterity. His style was suitable to the taste of his age. He had a wide range of knowledge, a nice faculty of psychological observation, and was by no means pedantic, but his philosophy was neither original nor deep. He is always ready to sacrifice the thought to a verbal antithesis. He wrote too much, and was not sufficiently diligent in philosophy. He is often tediously diffuse, and the same sentiment meets the reader again and again, disguised in a new dress. An excellent Roman critic censures his style as vitiated by agreeable faults, such as captivate boys. It is possible that ambition was his chief motive in writing. He may have aimed at obtaining political influence by winning literary reputation, but it would be unjust to deny him a genuine interest in philosophy, especially in its practical aspect, although from a higher point of view philosophy can only regard him, like Cicero, as a dabbler. Most of his philosophical works, composed at various times, are collected in 12 books under the title of Dialogues. They treat of the following subjects: 1. If there is a providence, why do good men meet with troubles? 5. Leisure. Both of these treatises were written after his retirement from public life. 3. Anger, in 3 books. 4. The Happy Life. 6. Tranquility of Mind. 7. Brevity of Life. 2. The Wise Man Receives Neither Injury Nor Insult. Also 3 works of consolation. 8. To a Lady on the Death of Her Son. 9. To Polybius the Freedman on the Loss of a Brother. And 10. To his mother Helvia on his own banishment. Beyond these dialogues there are extant the treatise On Clemency, written after Nero's accession, and 7 books De Beneficiis. Seneca also wrote a work in 7 or 8 books on questions of natural history, Naturales Quaestiones, which he dedicated to his young friend Lucilius, procurator of Sicily. We possess further a collection of letters addressed to the same Lucilius, and written with the intention of publication. They do not possess in any degree the interest which belongs to the letters of Cicero and Pliny. Seneca's satire on Claudius has been noticed already in another connection. Seneca wrote verse as well as prose. 9 tragedies have been preserved, all dealing with subjects of Greek mythology and founded on Greek originals. They are Hercules Furens, Troades or Hecuba, Phoenici or Thebais, Medea, Phaedra or Hippolytus, Oedipus, Agamemnon, Thyestes, and Hercules Oitaius. In the case of most of these plays, we possess the Greek originals, and can judge of the deplorable taste of the Neronian age by the manner in which Seneca has spoiled the works of the great masters, omitting all the finer touches, and smothering the action with declamation. The purpose of the characters in Seneca is to declaim. The action and the plot are of subordinate importance. It has been a disputed question whether these tragedies were meant for representation on the stage, and although they are in every way unsuitable for acting, it is nevertheless not impossible that in that age they may have been acted with applause. But it is probable that Seneca, in composing them, had the recitation of separate scenes before select audiences chiefly in view. The versification of these plays is very strict, and conforms to the rules of the Augustan poets. Besides the iambic trimeters and anapaests, Sapphic, Glyconic, and Asclepiad measures are also introduced, with little regard, however, to harmony of metre and subject. More interesting historically is the Fabula Praetexta, or tragedy with Roman characters, entitled Octavia, which used to be attributed to Seneca, and is always included among his works. The subject of this drama is the tragic fate of Nero's wife, and Seneca himself is one of the characters. He cannot, however, have been the author, as there is an allusion to the fall of Nero. it seems probable that the work was composed under the Flavian emperors, before the end of the 1st century, but even this cannot be regarded as certain. Seneca's contemporary and countryman, Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella of Gades, devoted himself to the subject of agriculture and tried to revive an interest in it, somewhat as Virgil had done nearly a century before. His uncle, a learned man, was an extensive farmer in Baetica, and so he had an opportunity of studying his subject practically. He wrote 2 prose treatises on agriculture, De Re Rustica, the second much more elaborate than the first. Of the first we possess 1 book, on trees, but the second, in 12 books, has been preserved entire. One of these books, the 10th, is composed in excellent hexameter verses. The author made this variation because horticulture, the subject of this book, had been omitted by Virgil. He intended it as a sort of supplement to the Georgics, the precepts, as he says, of the sidereal bard. Here may be mentioned other books on special subjects, such as the treatise on medicaments by Scribonius Largus, and the work De Chorographia in 3 books by the geographer Pomponius Mela of Tangentera in Spain. Quintus Asconius Pedianus composed his commentary on the speeches of Cicero about 55 A.D. This highly important work has been preserved in fragmentary form. The language is pure, the comments acute. He also wrote a work against the detractors of Virgil, but it has not survived. Grammatical investigation was represented by Marcus Valerius Probus of Berytus, who made eminent Latin writers the subject of criticism and explanations in the same way that the Alexandrine scholars treated classical Greek authors. He issued annotated editions of Virgil, Horace, and Lucretius, and he wrote and lectured on Old Latin. He enjoyed a high reputation with later workers in the same subject, as an illustrious grammarian and an acute critic. The most important writers on jurisprudence were Proclus, who gave his name to the Proculaean school, and Cassius Longinus, who was banished by Nero to Sardinia and recalled by Vespasian. It is possible that some of Seneca's tragedies were composed in the reign of Claudius, but the only poetical work which we can set down as probably belonging to his age is a panegyric in hexameters on the consul Piso, by an unknown youthful author, supposed by some to be Calpurnius. The poem is full of reminiscences of the Augustan poets, with whom the author was well acquainted. The versification is strict and elegant. There are only 2 elisions in the whole poem. Of Nero's effusions only a few odd lines have been preserved, but they seem to have been read and well known long after his death. The 2 most important poets of his reign were Persius and Lucan, who resembled each other in their Stoic doctrines, their somewhat precocious talents, and in their early deaths. Persius Flaccus was born in 34 A.D. at Volaterrae in Etruria, and died at the age of 28 in 62 A.D. He studied at Rome under the Stoic philosopher Annius Carnutus, for whom he entertained an affectionate regard, to which he has given expression in his writings. Having read Lucilius, he was stimulated to write poetical satires, and he was also much under the literary influence of Horace. His 6 satires have come down to us, but only one of them, the first, is a satire in our sense of the word. In it he ridicules the poets of the day and the prevailing public taste, but the others are merely tirades or sermons on Stoic texts, embroidered with some burlesque dramatic scenes. The persons introduced are generally borrowed from Lucilius or Horace, and the verses are full of phrases, beginnings and ends of lines, taken directly or in a modified form from these poets, especially from Horace. But in both style and spirit the satires of Persius are vastly different from those of his master. The Augustan poet was a genial Epicurean who laughed good-humouredly at the follies of mankind. The Neronian verse-writer was a Stoic preacher who aspired to amend the world. The youthful Persius takes upon himself to instruct mankind. The more mature Horace is content to amuse. It is to be remarked that Persius does not deal at all with contemporary politics. He does not regret the Republic or condemn the Empire. In point of style, It is unfortunate that Persius did not profit more by his study of Horace. He could not manage the hexameter with ease, his thoughts were poor, and he labored to express them with the utmost possible obscurity. His intentions were pure, but he had no originality and no poetical gift, and he tried to cover this defect by mannerism and affectation. A friend of Persius, Ctesias Bassus, may be mentioned as the chief representative of lyric poetry in Nero's reign. We do not possess any of his poetical works, but remains of his treatise on metric have been preserved. Epic poetry was very popular. Virgil was the model, and national subjects were in vogue. Nero entertained the project of writing an epos on the history of Rome. The Pharsalia of Lucan, 39 to 65 A.D., whom we have already met as one of the sufferers in connection with the conspiracy of Piso, is a poem on the civil wars in 10 books, left unfinished at the author's death. Lucan was brought up in a cultivated family. His grandfather was Seneca the rhetor, his uncle Seneca the philosopher. In his early years he was a great friend of Nero, who afterwards, however, became jealous of his literary reputation and forbade him to compose poetry. The Pharsalia was begun before the breach with the emperor, for the introductory verses contain a glowing panegyric on him. Lucan's epic must be considered a remarkable feat in its way, when it is remembered that the author died at the age of 26, but it has not a spark of genius. The practice, which was then in fashion, of reciting literary works before private audiences had a specially unfortunate effect on epic poetry. A poet, thinking of these recitations, was tempted to sacrifice the unity of the whole to the effectiveness of special scenes, which might be read aloud to applauding hearers. And for the same reason, poetry became rhetorical. The reciter wanted stuff to declaim. The Pharsalia is versified oratory, not poetry. Lucan is to be imitated, says Quintilian, hitting as usual the nail on the head, by orators rather than by poets. The choice of subject was very natural to a Stoic, breathing the atmosphere of Thrasea and Helvidius, and reared up with a deep veneration for the Senate, but from a literary point of view it was unfortunate. Pompey is the hero, but the miserable part which he played in the civil wars make the poem ridiculous. Cato is a sort of second hero, though perhaps, as has been cleverly said, the true hero is neither Pompey nor Cato, but the Senate. The cause of Caesar is denounced as crime. His victory is regarded not only as the death blow to freedom, but as the destruction of Rome's greatness. The work is full of stoical doctrine, pretentious phrases, sounding commonplaces, tedious speeches. The language is often difficult on account of its affectations, and the introduction of out-of-the-way geographical and mythological learning renders some parts of the work repulsive. But there are episodes which show considerable power of imagination, and there are many well-turned phrases, such as the epigram on Cato, Victrix causa Deis placuit sed victa Catoni, and the famous words on Pompeius Magnus, Stat magni nomini sumbra. If Virgil's epic inspired Lucan, and his Georgics Columella, his bucolics found an imitator in Calpurnius Siculus. It is uncertain whether Siculus designates the actual home of the poet, or was assumed on account of the Sicilian associations of Theocritus. He was a poor man, and begs some patron, whom he calls Melibœus, perhaps Seneca or Calpurnius Piso, to bring his productions under the emperor's notice. 7 eclogues are preserved. They are metrically exact, like the rest of the poetry of the age, but devoid of all originality, being copied from Virgil and the Greek pastoral writers. Nero, spoken of in court style as a god, is described as inaugurating a new period of freedom and clemency, and the 7th eclogue contains an account of magnificent games which he exhibited. The didactic poem entitled Aetna illustrates the tendency of the age to put the most unpromising subjects into verse. It discusses the scientific causes of volcanic phenomena, and combats the popular views diffused by the poets. The authorship is uncertain, but the most probable view ascribes the poem to Lucilius, the friend of Seneca, the same to whom the philosopher addressed his epistles. Lucilius was for a considerable time procurator in Sicily, and had an opportunity of studying the mountain. The poem contains echoes of Lucretius, but the author has none of Lucretius' power in investing a dry subject with poetic attraction. He rises higher when he is contrasting the pleasure of observing nature with the pettiness of human life. The poem ends with the story of two brothers who rescue their old parents in an eruption of the volcano. It is probable that to this age also belongs the Homerus Latinus, a short Latin version of the story of the Iliad, in some parts almost a translation of Homer. This was intended for use in schools, and has no merit except its scrupulously exact metre. Perhaps the most interesting work of Nero's age was the satirical work of Petronius Arbiter in 20 books. It may be considered almost certain that this Petronius was the same as the aesthetic voluptuary whose death by Nero's orders in 66 A.D. has been described in a foregoing chapter. His work, entitled Satirae or Satiricon, recounted all sorts of imaginary adventures in which he satirized the manners and weaknesses of his age. Unluckily, only fragments of the book remain, of which the largest is the Banquet of Trimalchio, describing a feast given by a wealthy, uneducated upstart in a Greek town of Campania, probably Cumae. The person who tells the tale is a freedman named Encolpius, who recounts his travelling experiences in company with Asiltis, another freedman, and Giton, a slave, in the last years of Claudius or the early years of Nero. The work is wonderfully clever and artistic, full of wit, humor, and delicate irony, displaying wide knowledge of the world and great dramatic power in making the persons introduced speak in character. The motive which united the various parts of the composition was probably the anger of the god Priapus, who may have played a part meant to travesty that of Poseidon in the Odyssey. The work is quite devoid of any moral tendency. The author shows a fine appreciation of Greek art, and satirizes pointedly the literary taste of the day. One of the characters is a vain poet named Eumolpus, who recites two poems of considerable length, the Troiae Halossis, or Capture of Troy, in iambic trimeters, and the Bellum Civile in hexameters. But the prose narrative sometimes passes into verse and all sorts of metres in the style of the Menippean satire. The former is clearly allusive to the poem of Nero on the same subject, and the Bellum Civile might be a parody of the Pharsalia. End of chapter 25, section 1.